Let's go off the grid.
Okay.
Let's go off the grid.
Okay.
I know that you really want to put your phone away.
Yeah.
Let's go off the grid.
Hello, and welcome to Off the Grid, a podcast about everything it takes to run a creative small business with radical generosity and energetic sovereignty. I'm your host, Amelia Fruby, and in today's episode, I am talking to my favorite HR expert. Is it even possible to have a favorite HR person? Well, if it is, Morgan Evans is definitely my favorite. Morgan runs a company called Business Casual, and she's here to talk to us about feedback, which I find to be a seemingly simple, but actually super emotionally challenging and often fraught topic. I don't know about you, but many times in my life, I have received feedback that really hurt my feelings. I've received feedback that was unsolicited. I've received feedback that was unexpected. I've received feedback that was even threatening and made my body truly go into fight or flight mode. So I am really excited to talk to Morgan about feedback. And in this conversation, we're going to get into what feedback really is and why the reviews and random emails we may get aren't actually feedback from Morgan's perspective. We're also going to talk about how to give and receive feedback that doesn't feel like shit. How can you offer criticism and praise in ways that you can really enjoy giving it and other people can really receive it? We'll discuss how we can create business systems that invite feedback, as well as ways to resolve conflict with clients, customers, and team members. By the end of this conversation, Morgan's also going to tell us why feedback is actually a social justice tool. It's a skill for resilience that we could all use to cultivate collectively. And we end on the really beautiful note of positive feedback and how to integrate it. So I hope that you pressed play on this episode because you want to learn more about feedback. Maybe you're arriving as someone who loves giving and receiving feedback, or maybe you're more like me and you find feedback kind of challenging. We get into a lot of personal lived experiences and examples here, and I'm so excited for you to hear this episode. Before we do that, I also want to let you know that Doors to the Interweb, which is our annual membership for artists, creators, and small business owners, will be opening to the Interweb waitlist very soon. But you have to be on the waitlist to learn more about the membership and get the invitation to join. If you listen to this show because you want to share your work online, you want to grow an audience, you want to make some money, and you want to do all of that without relying on social media or some of the big tech companies that are really problematic these days, if that's you, then I would love for you to join the Interweb waitlist so you can learn more about the membership when the doors open there at the end of this month. The Interweb is where we actually get into the more specific how-tos, the practical guides, the hands-on workshops, as well as the community camaraderie needed to really do this work. So if you're ready to not just be listening to this, but actually putting it into practice, the Interweb is for you. And the only way to join this spring is to get on the waitlist. Again, doors will be opening at the end of this month to the waitlist only. I'm going to put a link in the show notes so you can join the waitlist and be there when doors open. So let's dive in, shall we, to this conversation all about feedback with Morgan Evans of Business Casual. Hi, Morgan. Welcome to Off the Grid.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited to have you for many reasons. One, you're an Interweb member and have been a close Biz Friends participant, but more so, you're here today to talk about something that, quite honestly, I personally struggle with in business. And that thing is feedback. I have found that I am not always that open to feedback on my work, or that I struggle to receive it outside of certain contexts. I'm sure many of us can relate to having gotten an email that ruined our day with some hard feedback in it, or some unintentional weird vibes that were presented as feedback. And so in this conversation, we're talking about some of those hard things in business: feedback, failure, conflict, the stuff that comes up when you're really in relationship with other people and with your work. So, thanks for coming on today as our resident feedback expert.
My honor to have that title.
Could you start by just telling us what is feedback? Or maybe what do we think feedback is? And how do you like to reframe that for us?
Yeah, when I'm teaching folks about feedback, I often start with like asking people what it brings up in their body. And I think that's my instinct in terms of how we define feedback. It's like usually people think about it as like evaluation, a report card, kind of like a threat. We have negative bodily associations with the word. That's in my mind what I like to swim in the waters of like, we definitely think of feedback as something threatening, something scary, something nerve-wracking, and something activating. Because often like our brains experience the perception of threat coming and like the potentialness of like social rejection or hearing something hard. Like it lights up the same parts in our brain as like actual experience of physical pain. So feedback, insofar as we understand it, it makes us feel like we're going to hear something we're doing wrong.
Yeah.
So we tend to associate feedback with this idea of an evaluation, but I like to switch that and really like lower the heat on the word and think about it as not an evaluation, but an observation. I think about feedback as data. I worked for an organization where we redesigned our feedback system and I gave the name for the tool we built. I called it Sonar, so that because I think of feedback as truly almost like a bat will like echolocate to notice obstacles around it. I'm like, feedback is the data around you. It's people's observations of how they experience you. So I think about feedback as the art of offering a response to a person's action with the intention of affecting positive change and or deepening the relationship. So there's a lot of verbiage in there, but I think we tend to think about feedback as an evaluation, but my school of thought is let's shift it more to thinking about feedback as an observation.
Yeah. I really liked how you said like lowering the heat on it. That was helpful for me to hear. Just the sense of acknowledging that I do feel that threat in my body sometimes when I receive feedback or that, stress and panic. I sometimes literally get hot. Like my face will flush, my body temperature will rise. Anybody who's ever published something that gets public reviews, like a podcast or a book, like all you got to do is open up Goodreads or open up Apple Podcasts, and there's all this feedback there for you.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think that one of the things that's hard when you ask for the definition of feedback is I think we use that word to describe a bunch of different things. So where I come from, like reviews on a site from an anonymous person, that I don't think about that as feedback. I think about feedback as a relational tool and a relational skill where it's someone you're going to see again. So even if someone cuts you off on the highway and you like honk at them, like I don't think of that as feedback. Or sometimes like in a grocery store if someone is acting away, like giving a stranger information about how you think they could be doing what they're doing better, I think of that as different than feedback or reviews on a website.
You're so right, because I just lump it all together. I'm like, any and every response to my work is feedback for me. And I like literally consider like a conversation with a super close friend feedback and like my open rate on my emails feedback. And I love that you're helping me kind of pull back to be like, those two things are not the same.
It's information about how people experience you, but is it really feedback is like one of the first things we talk a lot about. So I'm really glad we're starting with this conversation with like, what are we even talking about here? Because I think we call a lot of things feedback that aren't.
Something I was thinking about as I was preparing for this was like these two locuses of feedback as giving feedback or receiving feedback. And I think they're each challenging in different ways, but I definitely have, different successes and struggles when I'm giving feedback than when I'm receiving feedback. So I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about that? Like, how do you begin with someone? Like, do you start with our ability to receive feedback or our ability to give feedback? What have you found to be the most helpful as we unpack this?
I usually start with the giving feedback bit of it because I think, especially in like a work context, when I'm practicing this with folks, I like to really focus it and ground it in real world examples. So usually it's like an easier starting place to be like, think of a real world example of feedback you have for someone, something you need to say but haven't known how to say it. And then I walk through like how to just like craft the message. So I feel like that's where I gear towards starting. But the more I research and learn about feedback and like talk to businesses and founders and leaders about feedback, the more I've sort of seen that there are different like we focus on giving feedback, but I think there's an interesting lever we could put more weight on in terms of receiving feedback. We do sort of think about it as a binary of like there's a feedback giver and a feedback receiver. But in my mind, the sort of like the third piece here, the like open door on the other side, and in a way like the silver bullet is this idea of gaining comfort with inviting feedback, which actually makes it easier both to give and to get. So there's like ways that I will like give people instruction around giving feedback in a way that's easy to hear and receiving feedback in a way where you can lower the heat. Like there's tactics for that. But I like to also think about this third wing of inviting feedback, where people are asking for it in a way that makes it easier for folks to give it and that calms your nervous system down in advance. So you're not like preparing for the blow of feedback. You're like, hey, that meeting felt a little weird for me. I think it might have been because I was speaking really quickly. Like, can you tell me about how you felt about my speed of talking? Did that work for you? Or were there other things that you felt led to the weird vibe? Feedback fascinates me because it is stressful and I can talk about it until I'm blue in the face, but it's still activating for me. I got a text just the other day from a friend that was saying, hey, I've noticed you've canceled plans with me the last few times. That's making me feel like you're not really prioritizing our relationship, like, which was honestly pretty well crafted. Like it's an intense text to get. Obviously, like the heat is high there. But I had to take my own medicine and be like, okay, let me calm my body down. Let me like look at this text and see words that are confusing or words that are hitting or, really try and unpack the message. So anyway, all to say I've got like some tips and kind of like insights around how to give it and how to receive it. But it's hard. And this wouldn't be interesting to me if it was easy.
Yeah.
I just want to caveat that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really glad you're foregrounding this because I do think that what we're talking about is like that feedback is not transactional. It's emotional and it's relational. And that means that every instance of it is unique in its own way because there's a different relationship present there. I think this is also why in a workplace or a business context, feedback can be very challenging because it's relational and emotional happening in a transactional setting. And that is a lot of layers to navigate together. So I'm curious, like going back to Feedback 101, like when you're teaching a workshop that's like, here's how you give better feedback. What is your advice to someone on how to do that?
Yeah, I love how you just phrase that with like this idea of it being emotional and relational in a transactional setting, because a lot of questions I get are like, how much of myself do I put in the feedback? Like if I'm someone's manager and what they did hurt my feelings, is that wildly inappropriate or is that important to foreground?
Yeah. And like same with like, I'm the business owner, they're the client. Can I share my feelings with them?
100%. Like where do our feelings live? And I think that's like goes back to like bringing your whole self to work. Like if that phrase has always bothered me because I'm like, what part of you would you look? There's no alternative. There's no world where you're not bringing your whole self to work from my perspective. But yeah, my like hot hit advice for when you're giving feedback, and this, I think even if you're in a transactional sense or in a relational sense, the really most important thing to keep in mind when you're beginning is giving the context. So the example of the friend of mine who gave me the text that was sort of like, I feel like you've been flaky lately. We had an earlier conversation about it. And so the context that person could have given me was like, hey, I know you've been going through a lot, or like, I really value our relationship. And I know that showing up and being present and keeping plans is something that you've talked to me about being really important. So to that end, I know this is a little intense, but I wanted to let you know that I've been feeling a little bit forgotten or kind of like not prioritized. That's led to X, Y, and Z for me. So giving a little context when you begin, which I really urge people to just like pull the curtain back and say like, I feel a little nervous to tell you this. Or one of my favorite feedback studies was done in a 7th grade classroom where it was time for the kids to do their term paper, and half of the students got just regular feedback like, hey, I'm giving you this, here's feedback on your paper. And the other half got something that the researchers called WISE feedback, where it said, hey, I'm giving you this feedback because I have high expectations of you and I know that you can reach them. And then the students that received that WISE feedback, they were not only more likely to engage with the teacher and do a revised version of the paper, but they all got better grades. And that context there works for adults as well as 13-year-olds. It's this idea of, hey, I'm going to place myself in the chair next to you and place the feedback here and be like, I'm telling you this because I care about you, because I know you want to become a VP of whatever. So that giving context is really important for giving feedback in a way that allows people to hear it. And then like this one is the blanket one, and the number one is just being specific. So often there's kind of this tension with feedback where it's like people are like, how do I give feedback on a pattern of behavior? I'm always urging people to be like, think about the last instance it happened and then give specific feedback on that, which in a way can feel a little disingenuous because you're like, they're always late, but I'm like, well, just talk about yesterday. And instead of saying late, say they came into the room at 12:45 for a 12:15 meeting. Like really be specific and focus on what happened observationally, not evaluationally. And then the conversation doesn't have to be like, I think you're a disrespectful person, like degree or disagree. It's like, you came late. And they can be like, I did come late. I was there at 12:07. But yeah, so this idea of giving some context of why you're saying it and what you hope to get out of it, being specific throughout. I always say, don't say sometimes, always, or never in your feedback. Those are just like red flags that it's not specific and that it's going to do the temperature raising, like amygdala hijacking for the person hearing it. And then the last piece, because I think it is relational and it is tough. So I always overemphasize this idea of ending where you're inviting a response and being like, what am I missing? What can I clarify? How is it to hear this? This idea of like, it's all data. Every conversation we have is in the middle of a conversation someone's having in their own head. So acknowledging that and being like, I'm not trying to say you're a bad friend or good manager or a bad manager. I'm just saying like, here's how I experienced this. I want to talk to you about it. Tell me more.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is set the context, be specific, and then also like sort of use that I language, the first person of like what you've just said multiple times now, like, here's how I'm experiencing this. So to share an example, like from my own business, for instance, I had a client who just had a lot going on in their life, and I totally understood that. And also was always sending me things late. And it was starting to impact like my ability to do a good job. And it got really tricky for me because I made a few mistakes and they gave me feedback on the mistakes, but I wasn't providing any feedback on why they were happening because I was feeling really rushed by the condensed timelines. And so my lack of feedback then got other feedback. And then there was this whole like thing that was hard to handle because I never provided feedback on something I was noticing in the first place. Now, this is a multi-layered example, but if I were to go back to the first step, maybe using your model, what I could have done was notice that things were late, notice that it was impacting me, and then I might craft feedback that went something like, I know that you have been having a hard year. I know that these things are happening in your life. I also know that we're committed to like an ongoing relationship as client and service provider. And so I want to flag that in this instance, you shared things 3 days late. In this instance, they were 5 days late. And as a result, I felt like I could not do good work to get things done on time. And could we discuss this? Is that how you would phrase that feedback?
Honestly, very, very good. I have like a few little tiny edits, but I think the beginning, I'm with you 100%. I feel like, especially when we're like finally gathering the courage to give feedback on something that's been like chafing away at us, there's the tendency to like bring a whole case and like show all the receipts. So my instinct here would be like to pick the last time it happened. So to be like, yesterday when like we had talked about that you emailing me back with input by Friday and then it didn't come till Sunday at midnight. So here was my experience of that. So talking about the specific one and zeroing in on a few more things. So I love how you started it. Like, I know this stuff is going on with you. I know we're both committed to making an amazing project happen here and to doing it in a way that like we're both proud of it and that it like, achieves these amazing, meaningful results in the world. So yesterday when this thing happened, this meant X, Y, and Z for me. I'm curious to hear more from you about your experience. So like what you want here is like for behavior change. You want this person to stop doing things late because of how it affects you, understanding of the whole ecosystem. And when someone's in like a tough life moment, one of the things about grief, about hardship, about when your life is on fire is like you get myopic, you're in the weeds of it and you like can't see other people and how it's affecting. So if they can understand in that little moment of even just handing something late on Tuesday, what that meant for your work product that day, then it can like offer some insight into your experience and being like, oh, then they understand more about it. And then they can kind of like shift their daily habits to create the behavior change versus like, I've been so bad, I'm sorry, Amelia.
Oh, I hate that response because it always makes me feel like I'm their parent or something. Like what I never actually want is the like, I've been bad, I'm sorry. But it's interesting. I'm appreciating what you're bringing up because to me, when I have the context of someone's having a hard time, in my mind, I'm like, well, I don't want to offer the feedback that this was late this one time. So I do let it start to stack up. But then by the time I offer feedback, it's been many times. And I feel like I shouldn't just point to the last time because then I don't feel like I'm going to get the behavior change I want. But what I'm hearing you say is like, that's because I haven't lowered the heat on my feedback. And perhaps no matter what's happening, I should at least be offering the feedback that like, this is late. Thank you so much. This is late. Or thank you so much. I was expecting this on Tuesday. Here's how this will adjust the timeline. I'm curious, like, how do you get the behavior change to happen in your way of framing the feedback that's very like context, specific, singular event question? What happens if they're just like, yeah, life has been really hard. And then I'm like, yeah, but stop sending it to me late. How do I get the behavior change?
Totally. Because what's happening here is also it's like apples to oranges. Like, because for them, it's a cause and effect. My life is hard. I can't get anything on time. You're one of a million baby birds I need to feed in this moment. Like, I'm doing the best I can, get off my back. I'm overwhelmed. And you're like, not in that. You're in a different context. You're like, I have deliverables. I have a million clients. If people don't put their stuff in on time, it kind of like ruins my day and makes me feel bad. So that's, I think, the part of the hard part is you're like trying to compare two same things, but you're operating from really different contexts, which is just true about human beings in general. But I guess it brings me to, I like, teach these workshops about feedback. I collaborated with an illustrator friend of mine and we made a poster called Feedback Can Be a Choking Hazard, which is like a long form, really niche visual pun around like when you keep feedback in your throat, you can choke on it. And it's as toxic to working relationships as like choking on real food. So all to say, I teach a lot of like infrastructure around feedback and how to design the message. But at the same time, and this is like a tension a little bit, I also say that all of that is true. And with feedback, it is always better to be prompt than perfect, which is why I think in the context of, dream world, I would have you and all of your clients fill out a little worksheet beforehand of like how I like to receive feedback, what I expect, like how I am about time. If I get something late to you, how would I like you to tell me? And vice versa. I think you were swallowing the feedback and in a sense, like not being so true to yourself because you were like, I don't want to bother this person. They're having a hard time. And I love what you said about like that you're already raising the heat on it and it's not even feedback yet. It's just like a little barb or like a little like
annoyance. It's a nuisance.
Exactly. Or it's just an annoyance. So we wait for it to be, it's hard to capture exactly the right spot when it's like more than an annoyance, but less than a pattern. But I think that's where I'm like, if we can just throw a little, like almost like like a yellow flag, be like, oh, that was a thing. Or like, even if, the next check-in with you have with them, hey, this happened last week, this thing came in a little late. I know you're dealing with a lot, but for me, what that means is, all of my projects get all stacked up. So tell me more about what was going on for you. How can I make sure this doesn't happen? Or like, what are ways, like, would a text reminder help in like 24 hours before? Or what are ways that I could make sure this happens? Or like, if I even knew a day before it, like, if you could just tell me as soon as it's going to be late, like, the idea is like to move it into like a creative space where you can problem solve it together. Because you also mentioned that because you'd been swallowing your feedback when this person was hammering you with feedback, it made it harder for you to receive because you were especially brittle because you've been like, I've been sparing your feelings and you're coming so hard at me. Like, this isn't fair. So I guess long-winded answer, but I think it's like as much as the specificness and the particular example is to kind of just right size it or like calibrate it, almost like to find a little middle ground so that you guys can be talking about the same thing, which is like the point at which they give you the copy edits on Friday.
Yeah. I mean, this is all so helpful. And if I'm being honest, like 2025 was just a long journey in uncovering all the people pleasing I do in my business. And lack of feedback is a piece of that. Avoiding feedback is a piece of that for me. And I think that's because feedback has had a real charge for me over time. But what this is also bringing up for me is, I think, a difference between feedback in your own business versus feedback in a workplace. Because in a workplace, I think there is much more of a shared context. Presumably, it's the company. And in a service provider business or just a customer product-based business, you really don't share that context. There's no shared workspace necessarily. Like, I have shared dashboards with my clients, but they don't constitute a full context. And I have found that can make it challenging to understand what is going on in their lives. And I've certainly had other clients where I'm like, I give them feedback, they've missed deadlines, and then they're like, oh, well, these 8 things are happening in my life. And I'm like, oh, well, if I knew any of that, I would have had a different conversation with you. So I think specificity is really helpful here. And there's a way in which we're both like widening the gaze of like, what is happening in your life? Where are our emotions, et cetera? But we're also really narrowing it to like, what is the site of the change? Because you're not going to make your life not hard just to upload your episodes on time, right? Like we have to pull that into the context, but then understand like a specific place for a shift. What else is coming up for me that I think is challenging here too is like, I came into my business definitely in the sort of 2020s era of like, build your systems, no exceptions. Everybody needs to work into your system. It has to be this way. And then like 2025 hit, and I was like, everybody's having their own hard life things and very specific struggles, and the system goes out the window so we can be like really kind and flexible and attentive with each other. And what I'm realizing is like kind of neither one really worked. Like there's a need for a different type of structure in our shared work together.
I think it's important to kind of like highlight and underline the fact that as a business owner, as your business ends up being like a funhouse mirror version of yourself. Or like, I really do feel this, where your neuroses are like take the shapes of products and clients, and your shadow selves, and also your best self. But it's a really mystifying and illuminating and humbling exercise in like seeing yourself outside yourself. And so I think it's hard to figure out what the feedback is. We're always on this journey of like, where do I end and where does my business begin? And like this complicated thing of like, the beating heart of my business is my beating heart, but also how do I separate these things? And I think that's how we evolve, is like like the separating, individuating from the business, allowing it to run without you, all of these complicated things. But yeah, I think that makes this conversation about feedback even more dense. Something I lean on a lot in my work is this idea of what structures can we create that will hold us now. And I think that's, not to pull the curtain back too far, but you did an amazing job in setting up this interview of like, here's how it's going to work. Like, if this happens, this happens. Like, you can expect this. It's going to go approximately this long. So I think we can do a little bit more of that with our clients and even with ourselves. Like, I try and do like with my day. Okay, it's Thursday. What am I going to try and get out of today? Like, what does success look like? I don't do that necessarily every day, but it's within our power to create the structures that we can then have to give feedback within. And we have to do that work, or it feels really Wild West. You're like, can I give this client feedback? Well, they seem to be giving me feedback. But so yeah, anyway, it's like easier said than done. But I think creating those structures and clarifying some expectations can really help the feedback game.
Yeah. Okay. That's so helpful, because what I'm hearing is like all of this can kind of be resolved if when I onboard a client, I tell them I give feedback early and often. And so if something is late, I will tell you. That is not a critique. It is not a condemnation. It is just information and an observation. And actually then beginning to do that instead of swallowing the feedback and then going through the whole situation I have now gone through with my other clients who I've struggled with around this. I want to ask a slightly like different version of this question, which is, I've given this example now that's about like something being late. And to me, like I do provide deadlines. So it's like there's a factualness to this. Like you knew the deadline, it was late. But not all feedback is that cut and dry, right? Sometimes it's just like, I don't like how you said that to me. So how do you take that into account with feedback? What if my struggle was like, every time I send a deliverable to a client, they give me a 25-point list of things that were wrong with it, and they tell me that they thought it was a really bad job, and that makes me feel bad. I mean, no one ever has done that to me, but like, what if it's like the sort of tone or the way that feedback is given to you that's what feels bad? How do you address that?
That's a really good question. And I sort of spoke about like tips for giving feedback, but I have a few for receiving feedback. And the number one is just like try and calm your body down and be like, if the feedback hits you like a punch in the gut, truly like number one is like take a minute, close your laptop, walk around, take you 5 minutes and like just breathe on it. Like when I got that text from my friend saying like, what I heard was you're a bad friend. That's not what it said. But when I got that text, I like put my phone away and was like, ugh, and I noticed like starting to sweat and just feeling like frustrated, like maybe I'm like clumsier or, like taking a minute, and I didn't respond to it right away. So I took a minute. And then like number two would be to like get curious, as much as that sounds like eye roll, this idea of like activating that curious state where, okay, so maybe you've taken 5 minutes, you pull up that 15-point really intense feedback and you look at it and you're like, okay, what is it? Is it just about the wall of text of this? Is it that the words are really harsh? Is it that, this text has a period in it and that's what is like activating me? Like truly like how can I look at this like a piece of art or like a piece of data that I have that I'm looking at? And is there anything that maybe you've heard before that's annoying to you? Or maybe it's the first time you're hearing it. Or are there words there, people talking about like your communication, like there's really blurry words. If you can underline and ask about those, like try and pull that person who just gave you like a kind of like dump truck of feedback, pull them into conversation around it. So it's where you're like asking like, can you say more about, or like, can you say this in a different way? Kind of trying to engage with it. And then, this is like an annoying last piece of advice here, but saying thanks for that feedback, because I think, you're in collaborate with lots of people and there's like a huge creative part to what you do. And I would imagine it's like stinks to get a whole 15-point bulleted list of feedback, but it also stinks to get zero feedback. So this idea of like, if at least they're telling you this stuff, so it's like, like people engaging with your work, it's like all we want in these days, like your attention is sacred, right? So people are putting their attention on you. And so if you can say like, find it in yourself to say like, thank you for engaging with this so thoroughly. Who knows? That just might be their style. But I think those are like 3 tips for sort of just trying to lower the heat and really like look at the thing. And then I think zeroing in on like, was it the time of day you got it? Was it the actual like method of it? Was it the timing of it? And then can you find the thing that you're giving feedback on? And is it feedback? Or is it just like, we all have different relationships to like being perceived, to getting input on like how we affect other people. And for some people that is incredibly alarming and disarming and dissociative, and that's okay. And for other people, they're like, tell me more about how, like they want to grapple with it. So really understanding your reaction to it and then getting clear on the message of what the feedback is for them.
I am really appreciating how we've sort of shifted to talking about receiving feedback here, and the way that you're still really inviting in that curiosity around like, let's go word by word, or let's go like moment by moment if it was a conversation and not something you can reread, and like think about like what feelings were coming up for me, what was triggering those feelings, and then why are those the feelings that are arising. I really appreciate the like depth of this sort of self-reflection and evaluation. And also, I think that in the instance of like a business owner and client or customer relationship, there's also a point where it's like, okay, I'm going to do that work once, maybe twice. If feedback is hard, I'm going to try to ask for what I might need this to look like. But I also think there's a point at the end of the day where it's like, if this really doesn't work for me, I don't have to keep working with this person. Like, I'm curious, how do you begin to shift from like, okay, we've worked through the feedback together, but when does it turn into more of like actually a boundary, or like we're changing the conversation here?
That's really important. I think that's like such a, because I feel like so often with small business owners, it's like we feel like we have to make it work. We have to say thank you for every single job. And I think reminding ourselves that these are, it's like at will employment, right? Like you don't have to make it work with a client that isn't talking to you respectfully. Or like in the example you shared of, like I was kind of like, maybe there's some nugget of goodness in there, but if someone is like speaking unkindly to you, like doing something again, using language you don't accept again and like,
or if they're misgendering you, or if they're like just being mean, like that's unacceptable.
No, that's where it's like, having some clear boundaries. Like we don't work with people who make us feel small. We don't work with people who don't understand the language that we require to feel respected. I think those are hard and fast rules, and you cannot compromise on those. And I think that in the context of a workshop, I've done this before where someone was like, I want to give feedback to my friend about this. And like in the context of filling out this worksheet and kind of like trying to mine out, like, what was the impact? What was the intent? Like what would I like to see them do differently? They were like, I don't want to save this person. I don't want to be friends with them anymore. I don't trust that this message will land and that they're invested in hearing this, because giving feedback is an act of care. I really believe that. And I think it's a huge investment of energy to receive it well and to give it well. And it's not that big of an investment to give it badly. So I'm always like, is there a way you can help them give it better by like doing those 3 steps I outlined? But it's not always feedback, and it's not always a relationship worth saving. And you have to be real with yourself about that and really like do some equations of like what's the risk and the reward here, and how much am I interested in investing in this person, and or this business relationship, are they going to meet me there? Are they going to match it? And is this a good use of my time, right?
Yeah, I really appreciate just like the emphasis on trying to meet in the feedback conversation and to really be in relationship there. And if you can't meet each other there, then maybe it's a different conversation or equation.
It's funny because like we're all different people who all assume everyone functions just like us. But when I come in and like facilitate a workshop for a group of like VPs or whatever, I'm sometimes bringing in structure that people aren't used to, where I'm like, we're going to use a talking order, which means no crosstalk, talk when it's your turn. And I do stuff like that to kind of like do an exercise of like leveling the power playing field just for the moment, where I am the arbiter, where I'm in charge of the, the 90 minutes or 3 hours or whatever I have. There's so many structures and powers and assumptions being made. And so when you can begin a client relationship, like putting some of that stuff, like how frequently do you like check-ins, like truly trying to set some norms around that. And if possible, do a little like erasing of the chalkboard and be like, we're going to start with this, where we're just going to listen, talk one at a time. And that way, it's kind of like what you said around, if you say like, I give feedback early and often, then you have the permission. So if someone's like, oh, can I just say something real quick? I'm like, actually, no, we're going to do it like this. But that I don't feel like such a mean parent. I'm just like, oh, that's the rules I set up. So I think this idea of like setting up structures that you can when things are cool can help allow you to get what you need or speak up for yourself when a boundary is approaching being crossed.
Yeah. And that's kind of reminding me of where I got a little bit lost earlier and trying to figure out like what's the difference between a structure that's like overbearing and doesn't allow us to meet where we are together, and the difference between a structure like this that what I'm hearing is it really kind of sets up processes that allow us to be more honest about what will and won't work for us. And I'm really hearing that sort of, going into a conversation with any new relationship, truly any relationship, and having a conversation that like lets go of assumptions, actually establishes boundaries and norms together, like create space for each of you to establish a boundary. Because I've definitely have clients who are like, I love to do everything over text message. And it's a hard no for me. I do not text clients, or like I will not give them my phone number. I had a client who was very triggered by the fact that I would not give her my phone number. She's mentioned it to me a million different times. But it's a hard boundary for me. And I think that it's also good to surface that at the beginning, because if for her, that's a like, I got to be able to text you about my show, then we just shouldn't work together. And that can be a neutral fact. Like we just won't function. But when it surfaces way down the line, it can feel very different. So I love what you're saying about like feedback actually starts before any feedback needs to be given. It starts in how you construct the sort of terms of your relationship together, whether that be a friendship or a client relationship. It starts by each of you sharing some like, these are my standard operating procedures. What of this may or may not work for you? Okay, I can change this, but not this. That's a hard boundary for me, things like that. And I think that you're so right that like the more you set that up in advance, the easier it is to give and receive feedback as you go, because you are starting from an agreed upon point, as opposed to like trying to agree on a point when there are already a lot of feelings in the room.
Yes, 100%. And I think people have so many assumptions and associations with like frequency of communication, like format. And I did a mediation for a client years ago where it was someone who had been an employee for a long time at this organization that was started by their best friend, and they'd worked there for years and years and years. And then there was a new employee who had like much more vast experience in the field. And so they were kind of having a little bit of a turf war around like who was more committed to the mission and who was, and like there was a lot of skepticism and like maybe jealousy or feelings of threatenedness from the longtime employee, and the other one was trying to prove herself. I was called in truly to do a conflict mediation session where they were fighting. It was not a good scene. The founder was like, this is keeping me up at night. But it turned out really the issue was about GChat. And the person who had been there for a long time was like, I need you to be on GChat. That is how we work here. That's the communication. And the other person was like, I can't be on GChat all the time. I'm pitching work. I'm trying to prove my value. And it's really distracting. And so we were able to like get to that little thing and then ultimately be like, I was like trying to ask all these questions. What does GChat mean to you? What other, and this person was like, I need you to be available like regularly. And she was like, and I was like, regularly, say more about that. And she was like, at least like every 20 minutes. And then that like lit the other person's like face relaxed. And she was like, oh, I can totally check GChat every 20 minutes. I just can't be constantly getting pings. And so, there was like an unlock moment there. But this idea that if you're not available on GChat, it signals to me you're not really committed to working here. And the other one being like, if I'm on GChat, I can't work. So I think that it's important, that was like obviously got extreme and like had to have a third party come in and like take the heat down from the conversation, because the stories were so glaringly obvious that they were each screaming at each other wordlessly about what the use or not use of GChat meant.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Also, like, RIP G chat.
I know. I'm like, what even is
Hey, friend, Amelia here. Thanks for tuning into this episode. I am popping on because I think that if you're still here, you are probably a friend, a fan, even a super fan of Off the Grid. And I want to make sure you know that doors to the interweb, our private membership and community space, are going to open next week. And the only way to be invited in is to be on the interweb waitlist. If you love Off the Grid, if you want more of what we are up to, if you want to meet other listeners, if you want to connect with me, head to the show notes, get yourself on the interweb waitlist, and join us. Until then, let's hang out off the grid and on the interweb.
You were just making me think as you were speaking before about the interesting kind of tension in the work that I do around like, well, wouldn't it be great if we set up all these structures in advance? And like, let's say you sent that one pager about what it's like to work with Amelia and how I am about feedback and time and text messages. But like the creation of that document, it will probably be satisfying for you. Some people might read it, right? But no matter how much structure we create, we forget it and it's hard, like people might read it but not remember it. So I'm like more structure, more explicit expectations, yes, 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 more contracts, like verbal contracts, not like litigious contracts, but like here's what I expect, here's what client means to me, here's what prompt means to me. And at the same time, what really moves me about feedback is that I think that it is a like one-off tool that exists, like it can exist without the structure, because I think as our structures in society that like once were created to support us, like as these structures are crumbling around us, I'm both wanting to create more thoughtful, intentional structures, but I'm also like, how do we exist when there aren't thoughtful structures that have been created to hold us? And I do see feedback creating the practice of that and not over-engineering it or over-architecturing it as a way of like structure from the ground up, in the sense that like individual feedback is a way toward helping convey care, helping each other be seen. And I go further to say that I think it can be a foundation for like social change and a step toward undoing oppression and marginalization and historical disenfranchisement in society. Like, I don't want to get too ahead of myself here, but I think that as we get better at feedback, it lays the groundwork for us to co-create structures that work for us and us to address like deeply baked in structural social justice issues that are like invisibly baked into and like strangling us in the world.
I agree with you. I think that the way we've talked about feedback so far is really about the ability to come to terms with harm that has happened, or with pain that has been caused, or even just with anxiety or stress that has emerged from an interaction. And I think that we are taught very, very few tools for doing that. Like, if I think about how I was actually taught to do that growing up, it was like, say you're sorry, whether you mean it or not, whether you've had any conversation or not, just say you're sorry and it's fine, right? There's simultaneously, I think, a minimizing of harm and a maximizing of harm, whereas we see these instances where people who have not caused harm are incarcerated or demonized, or, it can really be blown up into something huge. And then also we often experience these instances of feeling hurt and being told to get over it or accept an apology. And I think that what I'm really hearing and how you talk about feedback and what I'm learning from you in this conversation is it's really a way to actually meet in that moment, or like meet about that moment after that moment, and be in it together and decide together how to move past it. And I completely agree with you. Like, it becomes a very like interpersonal, small scale opportunity to think about like how we might address the very real harm that's like embedded in our systems and structures of society.
I love that, how you phrase it, like interpersonal, small scale, and that can ladder up really quickly. Like, I think feedback is a powerful tool for positive change, and it helps us like learn about ourselves, like the self-reflection that's implied in it. But it's something we practice on a relatively small scale, which makes it like manageable. But I think a lot about, and what you were just saying made me think about, it's like it's a restorative tool. It is this idea of, there's an article that Francis Lee wrote years ago around why we need more imperfect apologies. And I think with this world right now, in the way in which or cursorial culture that like we have, and the cancel culture. It's like created this spread right now where there is just so little air in the room to speak up about things for fear of being canceled, saying the wrong thing. And I feel like it's just like everyone's like locked in their houses, like peeking out their windows, being like, I don't want to get canceled. And so my vision here is that feedback can be like, like a little, like seedling sprouting up, or being like, oh my gosh, okay, this is how I'm experiencing. So that if you say something and you're like, I'm not sure if I can say this out loud or post this thing or publish this thing, like what if people around you were like, well, here's how that's hitting me. Well, here's what I'm confused about, or here's where I don't like that. And then together we can work on better statements and better manifestos that like don't cause harm. But I like coming to terms with pain, I think is something we need so much more like help with in our culture. And I think we're all afraid of pain, but I think on the way to coming to terms with pain, it's like we're all so craving being seen and interaction and like actual community. And I think that's what helps. It's like staying in community with people who've harmed you in little ways and talking about that pain. And when I do sexual harassment prevention training with some organizations, which is one of my favorite kind of like cringy compliance things to do, because I do it with a restorative approach where it's like we go around and I'm like, what might you need if you experience sexual harassment? And then the more interesting question is, what might you need if you author something that someone experiences as sexual harassment? Because I feel like that's kind of like the phase we're needing, that's the muscle we're needing to flex like as a culture. And with those of us who run businesses, you're like, we have a bit of a platform to try this of like, how do we stay in the conversation and create like resilient cultures around the inevitable pain we're going to cause one another. So I think we're talking a lot today around like annoyances or like friction at work, but I do think that's kind of like the loophole, that's the trap door into these bigger conversations of how can we talk about the big pain and like the big promise of like what comes next and how we're going to like take care of each other.
This really has me thinking that actually, like, when I came into this conversation, I was like, oh, feedback is so hard in my business. It's like the hardest place. But I'm like, actually, maybe my business is actually like a really great practice space that then like I'm much better able to give feedback in my marriage or like with my parents, those like really like rooted relationships in my life. And I think it works both ways. I think I've learned to give feedback in both spaces that improve how I do it in the others. But yeah, I'm just really feeling like the very clear ripple effects of just sort of even just like one tiny pebble dropped in water of feedback that can like really play out. I want to shift a bit here because we've talked about feedback really, I think, through like a transformative justice almost, or like sort of harm reduction lens. But not all feedback is negative or hard. Some feedback is really good. So and it's come up with my clients too. I've had many clients who tell me like, it feels so good if you just say you like the episode when you give it back to me. Or like, it feels so good just to know that like you listened to it and thought it was good, or you liked this specific thing about it. And it's great. It was so helpful when they told me that because I'm always thinking that. I just wasn't always putting it in my little comment that it was ready. And so I do it more and more now because it's been affirmed for me, or like people have told me that they really appreciate it and makes them feel good. So I'm curious if you have any, advice or thoughts on giving positive feedback, because feedback is not all negative or not all about harm.
Yes. First of all, yeah, I'm against binaries in general, and same for feedback. Like, I don't really, obviously there is like negative, and like I'm not trying to like be on a soapbox about this, but I do think like if we're going under the assumption that like feedback is data, it's an observation, not an evaluation. And if like my tips for giving feedback are like give context, be specific, and invite a response, like none of that requires it being negative. Like we tend to, I think like especially in the context of work and transactional stuff, where like business adjacent conversations around topics like feedback, we go toward the hard. We want to be working, we want to be productive. So we're like chewing on a tough morsel. But probably something I say more than anything else maybe to my clients is when people tell me about something that someone did that was well, or that was good, or an amazing interaction, or something one of their employees did. I'm always like, did you tell them? Like, did you tell them? Did you tell them? Did you tell them? That's what I'm constantly asking, because I think giving a little bit of context, being specific, and inviting the response around the positive feedback, it's such like free money. It's low hanging fruit, and it's the kind of thing that the more you do, the more other people will do. But it's because it's uncomfortable. Like we've talked a lot about like pain and the heat rising and like that stress of like getting blindsided by feedback that's bad. But actually, I find that my body and in my work, people are actually more uncomfortable receiving positive feedback. And when I was being trained as a mediator, I learned about this method, this like 6-step feedback model developed by this guy who was a law professor. He would do it. So after his students would like do a deposition or do a courtroom thing, we did after role playing a mediation, you would do 6 steps of self-reflection. First, here's what I think I did well. And then the group responds to what you think you did well. And then the group says other things you did well. And then step 4, here's what I think I didn't do so well. And then the group comments on what you said you didn't do well. And then the 6th and last step is the scariest part, like the stuff that I didn't do well that I had no idea about. And so that this is like where I'm like cowering. So there's a lot of artifice there, like a lot of structure. But what's interesting about that is like it's always when I try and model this with my clients, and when I run groups, I'm like, as I'm giving this as a tool for business owners and managers, I'm like, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and do this about the podcast interview I just did or about the workshop I just ran. It's like heat filled for my body. But I wanted to share that model because I think it makes the smallest last step for the scariest part of feedback, which is like the really scary stuff you don't know is coming. But the hardest part is like tooting your own horn or bragging. And I think but we all know how good it feels to get like unsolicited positive feedback and so I think sometimes I have to like remind myself in the same way I remind my clients, like, did you tell them to like send that email? Or I went to an event that a client ran the other day and I just, I had to remind myself. I'm like, I wrote them an email after being like, I'm so impressed by the way in which everyone was doing their part. And like, I've just really seen this organization grow over the years. And it just like created like buoyancy for even me sending it. So I do think that like, it really, I'm glad you like gave some airtime to that because I think it's one of those things that does feel like free money. It's like, feels good to give, feels good to get. It just have to kind of sometimes like have a little reminder. Like I've thought about like maybe like having a reminder like every Friday, like say something nice to someone, like acknowledge something nice they did. But I think there's like a whole school of, I remember there was a cover story in the Harvard Business Review years ago about basically research showing that like, don't bother with negative feedback, like stick with only positive, like put people in jobs where they're doing things they're good at and they like doing it and tell them what they're doing well. Like that is actually going to have a higher return on your investment than like coming for them with all the things they've messed up. And I think, you can overcorrect in that way, but I think there's real data saying like people are going to respond well to doing more of what you like than they are to doing like less of what you don't like.
100%. And I think about this a lot. When feedback feels arbitrary to me, whether it is positive or negative, like I don't enjoy it. Like it needs to feel genuine and meaningful and for a reason.
Specific, I would argue.
There you go. Yeah. Back to the specificity. I'm really taking that away from this.
That's like, if you can take one thing, I think that'll serve you. The whole idea of like my emphasis and my fixation on feedback is like, how can we kind of like engage in our relationships a little bit more, demand that we are seen, offer to see others, and just like really occupy our relationships and like dig deeper in our businesses, in our communities, and really like be present and like demand more from our colleagues and from like our time on this earth.
That's so beautiful. I love this so much. Well, Morgan, thank you so much for this like very, I feel like, wide-ranging and specific conversation that we've had about feedback. I'm feeling really grateful for all of the tools and reframes that you've offered me and the listeners today. And I just want even more of it. So if I was going to direct folks for how to connect with you and like what you have going on, where can they find you and how can they connect with your work?
Thank you for asking. This has been so delightful. I so appreciate your thoughtful reflections and the questions and just having this space to talk about this topic that is thorny and fascinating and complicated. So thank you for giving me this space to talk about something I love to talk about. So my company is called Business Casual. You can learn more about it at thisisbusinesscasual.com. And you can stay tuned there. I have a Substack article or newsletter. It's also called Business Casual, but you can stay tuned. I run cohort groups. I'm working on a radical manager training program because I think that's one of the infrastructures that I feel like we often don't give attention to. People are kind of just thrown into management. And I think that's speak to the sort of like thoughtful structures and infrastructures of care we need more of. I feel like management is one that gets an eye roll, but could use a lot more attention. But yeah, you can find me at thisisbusinesscasual.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I've loved this conversation. I love the positive feedback we're giving each other about it at the end. I also just really want to tell people to go to your website because it's so cool and I just love exploring it myself. So, yes, everyone, go to Morgan's website. Thank you so much, listeners, for spending this time with us. And until next time, we will see you off the grid.
I kinda hate social media, feeds on my brain like a bacteria. If you read my Wikipedia, it'll say I kinda hate social media. Post a picture of myself, sacrifice my mental health, use your product, time to sell. I would rather go to hell. Do you like this? Leave a comment. Can you share this? Will you wear this? Do you like this? Leave a comment. Can you share this? Will you wear this? Okay.
That was an abridged version of Social Media by Surfer Boy and Rectangle. To hear the entire song, find Surfer Boy on Spotify or head to the link in the show notes. Thanks so much to them for sharing the song with us, as well as to Melissa Caitlin Carter, who sings our theme song that you hear at the start of every show. I'm your host, Amelia Fruby, and if you enjoyed this episode, I hope you will download the free Leaving Social Media Toolkit at offthegrid.fun/toolkit. Until next time, I will see you off the grid.